Welcome back to Adventure Recap. Today we unpack the polarizing, brutal, horror, character study, Funny Games US. Spoilers ahead. Look out! And take care. An SUV with a boat attached to it glides across a quiet road. An Italian opera duet plays from inside of the vehicle. Meet George the husband, Anne the wife, and Georgie the son. They pull up to a fenced-in home at a lakeside villa, where they find George's brother Fred and his wife Eve playing golf with two guests. Anne rolls her window down and playfully remarks that they're cheating, because the two couples plan on going head-to-head in a friendly round of golf the following morning. Anne mentions that they have to launch the boat, and Fred says he'll come over in 20 minutes and help. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, Fred arrives with one of his guests, Paul, who's eager to help as well. We pick up the immediate feeling that something isn't right. George and Anne, they kind of pick up on it too, but they don't overanalyze it, even though they damn well should. While Anne begins to prepare steak in the kitchen, Georgie lets her know that they have company. She walks over to the door and sees Peter standing there. He tells her that Eve sent him, that she's cooking something and she could really use some eggs if they have any to spare. Happy to help her friend out, she gives him 4. But Peter doesn't even make it out the door before he already drops them on the floor. He apologizes profusely over and over again, says he's so clumsy, has 2 left hands, is such a klutz. As he's saying this, he accidentally bumps her phone into the sink. It's ruined completely. She begrudgingly gives him 4 more eggs and asks him to leave before he ruins something else in her house. He apologizes once more and thanks her again, and then he leaves. She barely has a moment to herself when she hears something and walks back into the entryway where she finds both Peter and Paul this time. It would appear as though they're stuck in there because of the dog growling and barking on the other side of the door. Anne apologizes embarrassed and shoos the dog away. She promises them that he's harmless and that when he does that, it just means he wants to play. But Paul lets her know that Peter is terrified of dogs. And moments ago, hers jumped on him and scared him something awful. The subject completely changes when Paul feasts his eyes on George's golf clubs, admires them from afar and then up close, pulls one out and holds it like it's the Holy Grail. He can't not beg her to let him try it out. She tells him to go for it if that's what he wants to do, so he does. Back on the boat, George and Georgie can hear the dog barking from where they're at. Then out of nowhere, a slight screeching sound leads to silence. George says he'll go check it out. As Paul heads back to the house, Anne meets him halfway and grabs the golf club. She seems to be really agitated at this point. He asks her where Tom is, and that kind of perplexes her, because inside, Paul referred to Tom as Peter. She asks him and his friend to please just leave now. He's fine doing that, but he's really confused. Did something happen? Did Tom say something? Was he rude? She says to please just go. Paul says he doesn't understand, but if that's what she insists, then fine. They won't bother her anymore. Just, get the eggs and then we'll be on our way. Get the eggs? Now she's even more confused. Paul explains that the dog jumped on Peter and it caused him to drop the eggs, so if they could get 4 more so they could bring the eggs back to Eve who needs them, that would be fantastic. They would leave right away. She refuses this time and tells them to get the hell out of her house. George walks in and Paul acts relieved to see him, someone who will understand his perspective and explain to her that this is just a misunderstanding. She demands that George help her get them out of the house, but he's just standing there trying to figure out what's going on. She starts to push Paul towards the door herself, but George stops her and he finds this funny. She can't believe this. Paul and Peter both try to explain what happened to George. Mrs. Thompson sent Peter over to get eggs. Anne was kind enough to give him 4, but he dropped them. She gave him 4 more, but their dog jumped on him and caused the eggs to spill from his hands. That time, it wasn't their fault. Annoyed beyond comprehension, Anne storms into the kitchen, grabs the carton, and hands him to George before leaving. She tells him that she isn't going to justify how she feels when she clearly feels as strongly as she does about this. The fact that she asked him to throw them out quite possibly means that she has her reasons. But do what you want, I've had enough, and she completely walks away. Still not sure of anything, he looks at Paul and Peter, or Tom, whatever, and explains to them that his wife does not feel well, and he can hardly play the mediator if he doesn't know the facts. Now please, leave. Peter moves towards George with his hands out as if to ask for the eggs, and George becomes even more confused than he was before. Paul says just give them to him. Now George is pissed, and he demands to know what's going on. Now Paul is pissed, okay? He says nothing is going on. She gave him the eggs, the dog attacked him, they broke. Now he wants some more. Is that so difficult to understand? Hey, George demands that he watches his tone, and Paul insists that he watches his, or he'll break his eggs. George slaps the smile right off of Paul's face. He moves past them towards the door, demanding they leave. Fast as lightning, Peter pulls the driver from the golf bag. We keep on George's face, but hear the muffled strike of the golf club smacking his leg. Georgie cries out in a panic. He kneels down and clings to his dad, and then he tries to fight Paul and Peter. They implore him to be nice because they don't want to hurt him.
You have to behave yourself.
Anne steps back into the room in shocked confusion. Georgie runs into her arms. Paul and Peter explain to her that they didn't start it, that George slapped Paul first. They recommend to bring George a chair to help him. Paul lets Anne know that if she'd like to call an ambulance or the police, he won't stop her. It's whatever she'd like to do. Defeated, Anne realizes what's going on. As she explains, Peter dropped her phone in the sink, thus ruining it. Things have only just started and the family already looks so hopeless. In an attempt to brighten the mood a little bit, Paul suggests they play the guessing game. He removes the golf ball from his pocket. Round 1, what is this? He drops the golf ball onto the floor and it rolls over to George. George answers, golf ball. Paul says correct, it's a golf ball, but why is it in my pocket? He suggests that Anne might know why. When no one answers, Peter answers and says, because you didn't hit it. Correct. Next round, the question is, why didn't he hit the golf ball? Peter goes again, because something stopped you. Correct. So he had to test the club another way. When Anne asks him where their dog is, he forces her to play a different game, hot and cold, to find their dog's body. Here in the shed, she's cold. Here up the steps, she's ice cold. As she walks down the road towards their car, she's getting warmer. For the very first time, Paul acknowledges the fact that he's aware of our existence. The game's clues of hot and cold lead Anne to their car. She wins. From a boat, George and Anne's friends, Betsy and Robert, call out to them to say hi. They saw their boat and figured they were there. Anne walks over with Paul. They have a delicate, kind conversation. Much in the same vein as earlier when Roger and Paul came over to help with the boat. We cut to the family study. Paul rearranges it accordingly to get the room how they'd like it to be. He insists the trio take a seat. Paul apologizes to George for earlier, but he'd like to think George would admit himself that the slap was a bit inappropriate. Paul kneels down so that he's eye level with George and he extends his hand. Says, I'm Paul. He then introduces his friend as Peter, and then looks at his friend and says, Tom, come here, where are your manners? Shake his hand. So Tom walks over to shake hands with George, but George doesn't feel much like shaking hands with either Peter or Paul. Anne brings him a painkiller for his leg. But frustrated and upset, Paul shoves Anne directly into George so that she lands on his leg. He could have shook his hand. Anne moves to attack Paul, leaving George open for Peter to slyly kick him in the leg. As Anne gets in Paul's face, Paul punches her in the gut, sending her tumbling back onto the couch. Georgie tries to attack Paul again, and Paul again tells him he needs to behave or his mom will get hurt.
So much stress for politeness sake.
George asks the two young men why they're doing this. Now instead of referring to him as Peter or Tom, Paul says, Tubby, explain to the man why we're doing this. But Tubby says he doesn't feel comfortable talking about it. Paul says don't be a drama queen. Tubby really struggles, so Paul explains it. See, Tubby's parents got divorced when he was really young. Tubby's mom left Tubby's dad so she could have Tubby all to herself. Hence why Tubby is gay and a criminal. Paul says the truth is Tubby's white trash. Comes from a deprived family, 5 siblings, all of whom are drug addicts. And his mom, okay, we're being honest here. Well, Tubby and her, they, get it on. Poor Tubby breaks down. Okay, Paul says he admits what they already know. None of what he said was true. Tubby here doesn't exhibit any sort of trait associated with being white trash. No, on the contrary, he's a spoiled brat. He acknowledges that Tubby is smiling now. He liked that one. Paul inquires as to whether or not they want another story. Peter acknowledges that he's hungry, so he gets up to go see what they have. As he leaves, Paul quietly tells him that the truth is Peter is a drug addict, and that's where he's going right now. Paul admits that he too is a drug addict, and that's what they do. They rob wealthy families in order to support their habit. George tells him that's enough, okay, he gets it. Paul is thrilled by this. He calls out to Tubby, Tubby, he gets it, he understands. Paul explains that they're going to make a bet now. Peter walks back into the room with food, sits down, and they explain that they're gonna bet that by the morning, say 9 o'clock, the 3 of them are gonna be dead, okay? The 3 of them can bet that they'll still be alive come the morning.
I mean, what do you think? You think they stand a chance? You're on their side, aren't you?
When Peter, or Tom, or Tubby admits that he's still hungry, Paul admits he's concerned for his friend. He says he needs to keep that sort of thing in check if he wants a body like, say, Anne's. That is a well taken care of body. But Peter's not so sure about that. So, Paul suggests in order for them to determine whether or not Paul is right that Anne does have a well taken care of body, they should see it for themselves. Let their eyes be the judge, not their instincts. They explain to Georgie that they're about to play a really fun game with him called Cat in the Bag. Here's how it works, okay? They remove a pillowcase from a pillow and they put it over Georgie's face so he can't see when they tell Anne to remove her clothes. Now they figured that Anne might not want to play this game or prove what Paul thinks, that she has an incredible body, so they use the bag that holds the cat, aka Georgie, to hurt the boy until Anne decides that she wants to play the game with them. She complies and sobs, and as bleak as things seemed before, they seem so much more bleak now. Paul mentions that Georgie had an accident, and as Peter goes to take him into another room to change, George lunges towards him as best he can. Amidst the struggle, Georgie runs away. As Georgie makes his way outside, Paul very calmly tapes Anne to restrain her so she can't move. And as he goes to begin his trek to find Georgie, he tells Peter that he hopes he doesn't get bored with him, and if he does, he can pour water on George's face. But just be careful not to ruin their carpet. Georgie tries to climb the fence, but it proves to be too hard. While running through his uncle and aunt's backyard, he triggers the lights to go on, looks to his right and sees Paul walking towards him in a stalking manner, like something out of a Michael Myers film. He runs inside, and unfortunately, it's there he finds the dead body of his extended family. To not only make Paul's presence known in Georgie's uncle's house, so Georgie is fully aware of what's going on, he also plays some really heavy metal music to just drive the point home that what Georgie did was not cool. But a dead body is not the only thing that Georgie found. As Paul approaches the kid, we learn that Georgie found a gun. Paul insists that Georgie cock the gun, and he does. He starts to walk towards Georgie, encouraging him to pull the trigger. When Georgie does and nothing happens, he realizes it's over. Paul returns with Georgie and the gun, and he lets George know that his son just tried to kill him. He knows that isn't something any parent wants to hear about their child, that they could be a killer, but it's the truth and he should know. But now they can play a new game. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Before we the audience sees who won, or if you're looking at it another way, who lost, we follow Paul into the kitchen to get food. As here in the kitchen, we hear a gunshot. Upon arriving back in the living room, we unfortunately find out that it was Georgie. After being broken down psychologically and then forced to watch their only son die via shotgun blast, there's doubtfully anything left in this once joyous married couple, and any hope for their survival seems more and more out of reach by the second. With her hands tied, Anne is puppeteered into the bowing stance. Paul explains to Anne that they're going to play a game. She's able to recite a prayer, and she does a good job. Not only will she get to choose which of them dies next, she gets to choose the method in which they die. Quick and painless, or slow and brutal. Anne somehow seizes the moment, grabs the shotgun right in front of Paul, shoots and kills Peter. Paul flips out, he grabs the shotgun from her and knocks her back on the couch, and then he frantically searches for the remote. When he finds it, Paul reverses the scene. And this time when she goes for the shotgun, he stops her. A significant fourth wall break. Significant because we now learn there is nothing that either George or Anne can do. They're going to die. Paul tells Anne she should not have done that, and to say goodbye to her husband. He walks over to George like he's disappointed, and then Paul and Peter lead Anne onto the dock. They get into Anne and George's boat, and they begin to sail. She's binded with her mouth taped shut. Then, in the middle of what seems to be a deep conversation between Paul and Peter about life and whatever, Paul so very casually dumps Anne over the side of the boat, leaving her to drown. The recap ends with them arriving on the other side of the lake, at Anne's friend's house, where the process begins again, when Paul this time asks,
Anne sent me over because some guest dropped by and she was wondering if you could help her out with some eggs.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's video, please subscribe with your post notifications on. It really helps out. See you tomorrow. That is a spoiler. Watch out and take care.